Hello, welcome. Thank you for clicking through to this video where I want to explain the Venturi effect from the regular Venturi effect that we see when we see a pipe and a restriction and a pump pushing through a fluid or air, etc., and comparing that to that in a carburetor fitted to an engine. There are some very slight differences there, and I'm only going to go into this in very slight detail. There's far more to this than what I'm going to explain, but over the years I've gathered that there's some confusion in our understanding. We just think that what's going on inside a carburetor Venturi and the pressures in there are the same as the Venturi effect that we usually see with the pump, and I just want to quickly explain the differences. And you usually find when we're looking at the Venturi effect that there's usually large equations attached to it. I won't be using any large equations here. There's enough information on YouTube with very clever people who can work out the mathematics on this, and they've got more than enough information there. I shall not be using any of that. I shall be keeping this very simple, and I shall be keeping it visual. And as always, these are how these systems work to the best of my knowledge and beliefs. So let's get started. Okay then, so first let's look at the usual and true explanation of the Venturi effect. So we've got a pipe there with a restriction in the middle. And generally there'll be a source of flow, so there'll be a pump which will generate the flow of fluid or air into the pipe. And generally when the Venturi effect is explained, it's explained using fluid. So in this instance we'll use a fluid then. So we've got a fluid pump here, and it's pumping in the fluid. So the cogs are turning in the centre there, and we've got the fluid flowing in. And that process continues and continues, and it's going into the pipe there, and the fluid's taking this direction round the cogs like that, and it's flowing across the pipe, and it's flowing at a certain pace. I will come back to that very shortly. Then it hits the restriction there, it goes through the restriction, flows out to the other side of the pipe, and then continues to wherever it's going to go. And so the pump turning there is creating that flow into the pipe, and that flow in the pipe is at a speed created by the pump, of course. And so as this pump constantly supplies the pipe with fluid, there's going to be a flow here equal to the flow here. Regardless of the restriction in the centre, these 2 points are going to be in equal flow status, and the pump has provided that flow status, that speed. And for a moment let's imagine that this pump's creating a nice steady flow. So the flow coming out of the pump is nice and steady, and it's going through that pipe at a nice steady pace. And if that flow is nice and steady enough to allow this fluid to pass through the restriction in the centre there and come out the other side without too much problem, so without it actually forcing its way through too hard, then they will maintain a flow through there nice and harmoniously without much pressure building up, or minimal pressure at the very least. But if this pump was to speed up and increase the amount of flow, so making that flow going into the pipe here faster, then I'm sure we'd agree that that flow of fluid there coming through at a faster pace might not be able to get through this restriction quick enough to allow a constant flow through. And so because we've got this restriction here that the fluid can't get through quick enough, there's going to be a backlog of pressure behind here in this part of the line, because that pump still wants to keep pumping in fluid. It's not going to stop, it's going to keep pumping in, and because the fluid can't get through that restriction quick enough, what's going to happen is we've got a pressure building up this side here. And so whilst there still maintains a flow through the centre here, we've got pressure that builds up and pushes outwards like this into the pipe. And those pressures felt by this side of the pipe won't be felt by this side, providing that this side doesn't have a restriction further down the line. And so it'll be allowed to just flow through without any pressure building up, because the fluid won't have to wait and be backed up in order to go through the smaller orifice. And that's why we generally say that a pump can only create flow. Because if the pump's working away, pushing in fluid into this pipe, and it's flowing freely, it'll just flow through without any pressures, or minimal pressure. And so in this case then, in order to create pressure, we need a restriction. And that's what we've been talking about, because we can't get that flow through that little orifice quick enough, and it creates that pressure. And so, as I mentioned earlier, these two areas of the pipe have the fluid moving through them at the same speed as each other. And at first glance we might wonder how that can happen, because of the restriction in the centre there. You'd think one side would be moving slower than the other, but it's not the case. If you notice the little arrow there moving across the restriction, you'll see that it's moving over faster. So the flow across there is moving faster. Because what happens is, because the volume on each side of the restriction is greater and there's a greater amount of fluid moving in one particular time, what happens is, in order to keep up with this on a smaller surface area in that restriction, because there's less space to get through, the fluid actually speeds up through it to allow for that movement. So it goes faster across the restriction there to allow the flow to maintain each side of it at a constant pace. In other words, to keep up with those fluids moving each side. So we're starting to build up a basic picture now of the Venturi effect. We can see the flows now, how they differ each side of the restriction and how it differs within the restriction and why. And we can see how the pump affects all of this by creating flow, and we can see how the restriction affects all of this by creating the pressure from the flow created by the pump, and how that pressure doesn't exist this side the pipe, providing there isn't another restriction further down the pipe from here. And that leaves me needing to explain what happens actually within that restriction there, because what happens inside that restriction with the flow of this fluid is different to what happens here in this pipe. As we've explained, in this pipe it's pushing outward because there's a pressure as well as it going through the restriction, but here inside the actual restriction itself, the fluid is moving so fast that it wants to get through that restriction so fast that there's no pressure pushing outward in this way. All of the energy is going this way because there's a high velocity, high speed of fluid going through here, and it wants to get to the other side, so the pressure drops. And if we were to quickly analyse why this fluid actually goes through the Venturi here and actually just goes through it rather than creates a pressure outwards, we'd see that if we look this side here, we've got a high pressure side. So there's a lot of pressure in there we already know about. And of course, if there's a high pressure this side and a lower pressure this side, then that pipe will want to try and equalise itself in the pressures. So what's happening there is that high pressure side will push that oil through that Venturi, and the oil will just go through the Venturi in an attempt to equalise. Of course, because the pump's still pumping, that won't ever happen, but that's what's happening. That's why it's putting all of its energy into moving across that restriction there rather than using any force outwards like this. So it's only going to move across in the fastest route possible to get to the other side, and that's horizontal through it. And I hope that now gives a better understanding of why there's a low pressure here inside this restriction, because we haven't got those forces forcing outward like this. And for a long time myself, I struggled with the idea that there was a low pressure here where the air's moving at high velocity, and I hope that's explained it as I've said. But it's because of this low pressure here inside the restriction is why we normally see main jets inside carburetors actually poke out into the restriction itself because of the low pressure, allowing the fuel to come up and then be drawn out by the high velocity air. Because if there was high pressure inside that restriction, it would just push back on the fuel and wouldn't allow the fuel to flow out of the jet. But what I want to put across and show here is that there are some slight differences between this usual Venturi effect that we're used to seeing and the Venturi effect of that we see inside carburetors. And so let's take a look at another example here then next to it so we can compare the two. And this time what I'm trying to represent here is a Venturi system inside a carburetor. So let's imagine this is inside the centre of the carburetor, as I've said, and of course a carburetor sits on the side of an engine. So we'll put an engine on this side, and now when we look at this picture I'm just trying to explain that we've got an engine now with a carburetor sitting on it. I haven't shown the actual carburetor, just the Venturi, because that's all I'm going to talk about. But these things aren't to true scale, so I'm just making this as an example. But taking a look now at the differences between these two Venturis, we've got to start by looking at the source of flow. So what I mean by that is the source of energy. So the energy that's creating the flow of either the fluid or the air, etc. And as we know, with the top one here, we've got the pump that's doing just that. It's creating all of that flow into this pipe here, and then that's building up pressure because not all of that fluid can get through the restriction quick enough. So we know what the flow is there. It's coming from the pump. But for the Venturi down here attached to the engine, things are a little bit different. For this one, of course, there's no pump existing here forcing pressure into this pipe as we see with the top one there using the pump. Instead, that flow comes from the engine, and that's in the form of a vacuum. Each time the piston travels downwards, it creates a vacuum behind it and pulls in through the Venturi. So it's a sucking action rather than a pushing action. And so that vacuum, of course, starts to draw in air from the air filter each time that piston lowers. And that air being sucked in hits the restriction, as with the first Venturi we looked at. The only difference being is it's being sucked in into the restriction, where the top one is being pushed into the restriction. And so if we could just pause in this position for a moment, we can have a look at the forces going on in this Venturi. Well, of course, as we keep mentioning, we haven't got the same pressure here as we have here in this Venturi, because we haven't got the pump constantly feeding into that line there. Instead, it's getting its energy to flow actually through the Venturi itself here, obviously created by the downward motion of the piston, sucking through, creating that vacuum. And that's why this side of the pipe here, compared to the top one, has very little pressure. If any pressure, it's going to have a vacuum, whereas the top one, as we've mentioned, has got a positive pressure. So in a nutshell, the top one here, flow is being forced through the Venturi from behind it, and on the bottom one here, flow is being pulled into the Venturi by vacuum. And so in the light of that vacuum pressure pulling through there then, if we're to look at the pressure in the line here, so in the Venturi at this point, we'd see that there would be a vacuum pressure here rather than a positive pushing pressure as we've seen above. But the main pressures on the bottom Venturi here are in this area of the line, because it's this area of the line here that is trying to draw all of that air into the engine for the engine's needs, and it's trying to do so whilst trying to pull it through that small restriction. And because of that restriction, it's restricting the air, the actual vacuum pressure here starts to build and build as the piston lowers. As the piston requires more air, more vacuum starts to build up in this area here. And that's why this system, this type of Venturi with the engine on this side, is ideal to run an engine. It's actually perfect because, as well as the low pressure inside that restriction there, allowing fuel to rise up the main jet and out rather than be pushed back with a pressure, it also builds up that vacuum inside this area here and draws out all of that fuel into the system for the engine to use for combustion. So the key differences between these two Venturis are the top one has got positive pushing pressures, exerting forces, and the bottom one has got negative vacuum pressures, exerting forces. And at that, I hope I've explained in a very, very basic way how these Venturis work and the differences between the two. I just wanted to make this video because of the differences. There are some slight differences that we don't always realise. And as always, as I've said, this is how these systems work to the best of my knowledge and beliefs over the years I've been working on these types of machines. And so if you have found this video of benefit, please do like and subscribe if you haven't done already. I did keep away from the mathematics on purpose, and I've tried to keep it simple, but in doing so I've sort of only scratched the surface of Venturis, but I hope I've explained things. Thank you for watching.